morning.
Hi, John.
Hi. I remembered to hit record this time. To all of you who were asking about the recording from last week, I failed to record the audio or video for the class. Instead, I recorded just the comments in the chat window. Oops. Naomi, it's really good to see your face. Been thinking so much about you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wishing you comfort. Good to see you. Hi, everyone. Hi, Donna.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hey, Dad. Hi, Mom. How are you?
Hi, honey.
Hi, sweetie.
How's Rhode Island?
Wet and wet. Boring.
Okay.
Hi, honey.
You got over 46 participants and you're not serving food. How could you do that?
This is the best, actually. You can have as much food as you like at this class, and we don't have to clean up after.
We're coming to your house for bagels, Alan.
Thanks.
Great. I have 3 dozen bagels from Zabar's in the freezer right now.
Oh, lucky you. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Somebody surprised me with a gift. So we're still letting a few people roll in. This dreary morning. Thank you for making a little time to have your spirits lifted by talking about death. Hi, Dora. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. As is the usual custom, we kind of spend a couple minutes just getting oriented. Zoom etiquette. As a refresh, I think at this point most of you have already participated, but especially if this is your first time, we're going to do our best to allow the class to be both so that you can hear and follow my presentation, and also I'll periodically open up the discussion for comments or questions. The best way to signal that you have a comment or something you'd like to ask is by using the raise hand function in the participants window. So the way to call that up is at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a series of icons, and the one that looks like 2 little bobbleheads says participants. And when you click that, it calls up a sidebar for Zoom that allows you to see the names of all of the members of the class who are joining us to learn together today. And if you have a question, at the bottom of the list of names, you'll see a series of icons. And you might even have on your, it looks like a tiny blue hand like this. And when you click the blue hand, a blue hand appears next to your picture window and your name in the participants window, and allows me to see that you have a question. As always, we're going to try and make it so that no one voice dominates the conversation, but all voices that would like to add to the conversation are able to be acknowledged. So that's sort of the that's my 2-minute Zoom etiquette. That, and please wear pants if you're getting up from.
Not the next one.
there's some very funny memes going around about Zoom fails and people who are doing all sorts of things that they don't realize are either on camera or on microphone. So just please be aware that you may be in your own home, but this is not, but you are not actually silent or invisible. So once again, good morning. Right now, we have almost 60 people here. That feels to me like a sextuple minion feels like a good place to start. So what I'm going to do is mute us, invite us to bless. I'll continue to keep track of people who are joining the class by admitting them to the class, electronically, of course. So you're muted, but I'm giving every person the ability to unmute him or herself. Just use that with sparingly, please, and only when necessary, or when I've invited you to chime in. Here we go. I hope you'll join me in saying the blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We give thanks to the source of blessing in our lives for the special blessing and gift of being able to study together and immerse ourselves in sacred tradition. So just want to make sure that my microphone level is high enough. So I'm going to switch microphones. Bear with me. Testing 1, 2. Still hear me? Yeah? Does that sound good? Okay, good. I'm going to assume that I'm audible enough. I've put on my good microphone. And I can still hear those of you who are chiming in. And if you have any trouble hearing me, you can just start gesticulating frantically and all should be well. Or use the raised hand function. Now, there's a Judy's iPhone raised her hand. Does that mean that Judy's iPhone wants to speak? I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's possible. Good morning. Good morning to
Morning.
everyone. Thank you. I have a hearing problem and one of my hearing aids has died. I wondered if it's possible to increase the microphone a little bit, please.
I can turn up my microphone, and can you turn up the sound on your device as well?
It's turned up, unfortunately, as far as it'll go. Thanks.
Okay, let me see. There's a threshold for how loud I can make my.
Sure, whatever.
Okay, thanks,
Whatever's
Judy.
convenient.
All right, it's
Thank
at the max right now. Am I over loud for anyone? You can also turn down the sound on your device. So that's as loud as I can make myself. Okay.
Bavokasha. Thank you.
Welcome to Darabah. Thanks, Judy. Nice to hear your voice, by the way. Hey, Jeff. All right, just a couple more people rolling in, so I don't want them to feel that they've missed any of the excitement. Let me begin just by doing a little bit of recapping from where we left off last week. So in our ongoing exploration of Judaism's many views and many voices on the subject of what happens to us after we die, last week was almost exclusively oriented around the writing of Maimonides. And Maimonides is both a rabbi deeply saturated and conversant with the traditional liturgy, the sacred literature, Bible, that is to say Torah, Bible, Talmud, and also an Aristotelian philosopher. And that doesn't even include his other resume credentials, such as court advisor and notable physician. And so he really was a polymath. And on the one hand, wrote literature that can be described as exoteric, meaning designed for mass consumption, where mass consumption doesn't mean works of popular fiction, but Maimonides was writing for a mass Jewish audience. He had an ambitious agenda, literarily speaking, to communicate to the entire Jewish people in very plain spoken Hebrew how to be a Jew. And that is reflected in his largest work called Mishneh Torah, which is basically a guide or a law code for all of the thou shalts and thou shalt nots of Jewish living. And more than just the what to do, but some rationale behind it. But he basically said, I'm going to make this easy for you Jewish people. You no longer have to immerse yourself in the 36 volumes of the Talmud. You can just read my Mishneh Torah and you know how to be a Jew. And then he also wrote in an esoteric mode, deriving his own insights from philosophical inquiry and scientific inquiry, what he would have thought of as scientific inquiry, though, scientific method obviously is something that it becomes much more rigorous in the centuries after Maimonides. And that wisdom was designed for a much, much smaller group of his intellectually elite disciples. And what's interesting is that the two genres of Maimonidean literature do not always harmonize very well one with the other. So on the subject of deepest intrigue for us last week, we can see that Maimonides appears to be saying a number of different things about resurrection, and those things may not be internally consistent. So we saw that on the one hand, Maimonides pens as a young man 13 articles of faith. Even the fact that he is responsible for writing a kind of catechism for the Jewish people, is itself fascinating. The last of these principles is that a Jew must believe that God will resurrect the dead. And it's the only one of his 13 articles that doesn't have any kind of like qualifying explanation. He just says, yeah, resurrection is a principle that is well attested in Judaism, going all the way back to the Bible. And everybody knows this, and I have nothing further to say on the subject. And the evidence suggests that Maimonides never fully escaped from a critique that accompanied him on this matter, that he seems to have been forced at a number of times throughout his literary career to defend his views on resurrection. The assumption is that Maimonides was accused of not actually believing what he was saying. And so we have this fascinating dialectic within Maimonidean literature that leads to the kind of unsolved mystery. Does Maimonides believe, or does Maimonides not believe in resurrection? And he pays lip service to the idea of resurrection. He says that he believes it. He says that anyone thinks that what he was saying before is that resurrection is only a metaphor, has it dead wrong. And yet there is insufficient evidence to suggest that his reasons for writing about resurrection stemmed from a place of pure personal belief in the subject. I am among those readers of Maimonides who falls into the camp of having concluded that when Maimonides is talking about resurrection, or promoting the idea of resurrection, he is doing so in order to satisfy his critics, and because he understood that this was an idea that by the time of Maimonides, by the 12th, 13th centuries of the Common Era, had been so widely embraced and was so deeply embedded in the tradition that for the common Jew, it was not worth disputing the matter. And yet, it's very clear that if you really read Maimonides in some depth, somebody keeps unmuting. So if you could just keep yourself muted. And we're also having, I don't know if Charlotte Bernardo was able to hear me. It seems that she's having trouble joining the Zoom, and I seem unable to troubleshoot that because she's still in the waiting room. Nope, she just left the waiting room. Okay. Just want to make sure that we don't have anybody who is feeling like they're behind a closed door knocking to get in and I'm not letting them in. So there seems to be some evidence in Maimonides' esoteric, that's with an S, not an X, in his esoteric literature, that his views on resurrection are really just a kind of a nod to the necessity of acknowledging it. And yet what he really favors when it comes to his own views of what happens after you die is a bodiless expression of immortality, namely that one is, at the time of death, playing off of the Aristotelian or the Greek, the Platonic idea that death can be defined as when your soul and body dissociate. We're going to talk a lot about that today. The soul being immortal, the body being corporeal and therefore mortal. The soul lives on forever, and that the highest and last expression of one's life is that one's soul might, if attaining a certain level of intellectual advancement, one might commune eternally with God, who is bodiless and can be best described as the active intellect of the universe. That is where Maimonides goes, and it leads him into all sorts of mental gymnastics. The last piece of literature we looked at from Maimonides last week was a long defense of his views on resurrection that he wrote later in life, that may not even have been Maimonides' own writing. It may have been simply a pious fraud or attributed to Maimonides. And he basically said, no, anyone who thinks I don't believe in resurrection doesn't have it right. So what happens is you live, then you die, and your soul floats around eternally. And at some point, God resurrects the dead, and the soul rejoins the body. And then you die again, and this time the highest and final expression of one's soul is that it lives on with God forever and ever and ever.
Very Hindu.
Okay, somebody is still unmuting oneself. So could you please keep yourself muted. Thank you so much. All right. And still having trouble with iPad Charlotte Bernardo. Not sure what's happening there. Okay. I'm going to do my best to make sure that I can't be held responsible for anyone who isn't able to get into the Zoom. If anyone knows Charlotte Bernardo and wants to give her a call, maybe she'd like to hear from you. Okay, let's, because it really looks like she's struggling to connect her device to the Zoom. Okay, so that's my recap from last week. This week we're going to move both in time and in space, and in focus from the Maimonidean view, which is largely a Greek philosophical refinement through Maimonides' unique lens on the Jewish tradition, to a broad array of literatures that are all classified as mystical in nature. So we're going to look at Jewish mysticism, which is sometimes, again, broadly referred to as Kabbalah, or you may have heard it called Kabbalah, like the Kabbalah Center in Los Angeles, which has only a tenuous connection to actual Kabbalah. So Kabbalah is a word that means tradition. It's literally from the verb likabel, which means to receive. So that which is received. Kabbalah is also in the language that we use when we talk about the service that we hold on Friday evenings. We call that Kabbalat Shabbat, which is a little bit of a play on words. Kabbalat Shabbat literally means receiving the Sabbath or welcoming Shabbat. Lecha dodi likrat kala pnei Shabbat nikabela. Yeah, you might hear it in that word. Lecha dodi meaning, come, O beloved, likrat kala, to greet the bride, the Sabbath envisioned as a bride. Pnei Shabbat nikabela, let us welcome or receive Pnei Shabbat, literally the punam, the face of the Sabbath. I say it's a pun because not only is the Friday evening service designed to welcome or receive the Sabbath, it is also a service that was highly influenced and developed by the Kabbalists, the chief exponents of Kabbalistic thinking. And a good place to start, or a good window through which to observe this, is exactly the hymn by Shlomo Alkabetz from the 16th century, the 16th century that I just shared with you, Lecha Dodi, one of our Shabbat songs, that envisions the Sabbath as a bride, the Jewish people as the groom, and the Sabbath experience as a 24 or 25-hour wedding of spiritual communion between the Jewish people and the divine Sabbath. And Lecha Dodi can be described as a Kabbalistic expression of Judaism. One, because it was written by people who were saturated in the literature of the Kabbalah, but even more because it is of a type with all mystical literature, or the nature of the mystical experience. Put simply, mysticism is any religious expression, and all religions across the world have mystical expressions or mystical strands or strains of the religion. Mysticism is any religious expression that puts its emphasis on the immediate awareness of one's relationship with God, on a direct and intimate consciousness of the divine presence. A scholar of mysticism named Rufus Jones has declared that mysticism is religion in its most acute, intense, and living stage. So not all of Judaism is mysticism. Much of Judaism is not, and much of the Judaism we practice, for instance, is not. Conventionally, lighting a menorah, or lighting a Hanukkah menorah, Chanukiah on Hanukkah, is not a mystical experience. It is instead the fulfillment of a mitzvah in order for Jews to retell a story from the Talmud about the miraculous oil. And even more than that, it has historical antecedents in the kindling of lights when the Maccabees rededicated the temple in Jerusalem after their victory over the forces of Antiochus IV. That is not mysticism. Not all ritual is mysticism. However, Jewish practices such as if you watch Hasidic Jews chant a nigun, a melody without words, over and over and over again like a mantra, what is the point of that kind of religious awareness or expression? The answer is to generate or create a mystical experience of the divine, literally to have a direct, intimate encounter with what we might call the numinous, Numinous, the sublime, the immaterial part of cosmic experience that human beings can, but do not always allow themselves to experience. And so the word experience is also inseparable from mysticism. Mysticism is experiential religion. Specifically in Judaism, mysticism encompasses a broad array, as I have said, of practice, tradition, ritual, thinking, compiled in lots of different sources, dating all the way back even to the Bible. You do have a small handful of biblical passages that speak in a way that could be described as a mystical experience or a mystical expression of Judaism, long before we have a term called Kabbalah that refers to Jewish mysticism. So you have, for instance, a passage in the 24th chapter of Exodus, after Moses has conveyed all of the laws up on Sinai. They have a little lunch party at the top of Mount Sinai for Moses and 70 elders of the community and the priestly family, and they all go up to the top of Mount Sinai, and there's this very strange passage that describes how they witnessed the very feet of God sitting on the throne, and they have like this transformative vision of the divine. They are right there in front of God, and they're actually describing what it is like to see God, and then they have lunch. It's a very interesting passage. They have a meal together, and then they go down. Or the famous passage in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah has a vision of being in the very throne room of God, and God is sitting on the throne surrounded by angels that are flying up and down, and they are saying, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Melochol Haaretz Kivodo, a very important line in Jewish tradition. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. Melochol Haaretz Kivodo. Conventionally translated, the whole earth or the fullness of the earth is God's glory. What that means is a matter of quite some inquiry and very few definitive conclusions. And we're going to come back to that line. Melo chol haaretz kivodo. If you're familiar with the morning prayers, the Kedusha prayer includes that line from the book of Isaiah. The awareness that the prophet brings that while visioning himself surrounded by the angels, flying around and floating around the throne of God, and is moved to declare almost spontaneously, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. Melo chol haaretz kivodo. What does that mean? Maybe the entire earth is filled with God's glory. But if you read a lot of Jewish mystical texts, you will see that there's a different way of understanding that verse, and we will come to that. Other notions that may be familiar to you from Jewish mystical tradition. The idea of Tikkun Olam, or Tikkun Olam, should be familiar to anyone who has spent some time in the lobby of Westchester Reformed Temple, since it's one of the 5 pillars of our temple's mission statement. That is to say, it is one of the overarching ways in which WRT organizes our work, our sacred mission. Tikkun Olam is one of those 5 pillars. And we actually created 5 pillars framed in cedar panels that you can see the next time, please God, we're all in the building together. One of them says Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam literally means repairing the world. But you remember from a few weeks ago that Olam has a dimension of both time and space. So it's not just repairing the physical world. It literally means repairing the cosmos, both time and space. We, in the last 50 years or so, particularly in liberal Jewish streams, such as Reform Judaism, have adopted Tikkun Olam as a kind of catch-all phrase that means anytime you do a good deed, you're repairing the world, right? You go to a soup kitchen, you feed hungry people, Tikkun Olam. You're collecting goods and donations to support people in need, Tikkun Olam. You spent a Sunday afternoon with the confirmation class working, stripping paint in low-income housing so that residents can live safely and comfortably, Tikkun Olam. Unfortunately, in my view, those very quick associations with Tikkun Olam, which have almost become its new definition, do not in any way give justice to the fullness of that expression as it originally comes up in our literature. Actually, originally Tikkun Olam is found in the Talmud, meaning the social order. It's kind of a, or I would say like stability within society. Literally, Tikkun HaOlam is used to define, for instance, why a society might have to think twice before paying ransom for people who are kidnapped by evildoers. The answer is said, well, for the sake of Tikkun HaOlam. In other words, we can't have societies spending their precious wealth on giving money to terrorists because it will destroy the social order. So there are appeals to Tikkun Olam in the rabbinic literature that do not sound anything like the way we conventionally use the term in our setting today. The mystics, however, are really the ones who give Tikkun Olam its fullest expression. For the Kabbalists, Tikkun Olam is actually descriptive of the way in which human beings, Jews in particular, make themselves partners with the divine in healing the brokenness of the world in a mystical sense. And actually any mitzvah in the full Kabbalistic framework is an effort in the direction of Tikkun Olam. And that's, by the way, why when you see the Lubavitcher Chassids with their mitzvah mobiles asking you, are you Jewish? Have you put on tefillin? Lubavitcher Hasidic thought, or Hasidic thought in general, is a mystical tradition. It's a Kabbalistic tradition. And we'll talk more about that, and why Hasidism is so saturated in the mystical. That basically believes that every time a Jew does a mitzvah, that Jew helps to bring about the Tikkun Olam, the restoration of a broken world, and brings nearer the day when Mashiach, the Messiah, will come and redeem the world as we understand it from its suffering and restore the rightful place of God as the loving, beneficent, and all-powerful ruler over all. That is a mystical notion, by the way, that the putting, and that's why so much of Hasidic practice is experiential, right? It's not only about studying and learning. It's very much about the doing. It's the tactile. It's the sensory, right? You got to put on those tefillin. It's not enough just to talk about the mitzvah of tefillin like I do. Okay. Let me just say a couple more words about this. Before, why don't we do some reading together? Because mysticism is hard to describe and perhaps a little bit easier to grasp when you're actually reading mystical literature. But again, there's not one book of mysticism. There are chief works of mysticism within the Jewish canon. The most famous work of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah is called the Zohar, which is a 13th century work composed in Spain that passes itself off as the revealed wisdom to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, who were holed up in a cave, hiding out from the Romans for, well, it ends up being for 12 months or 12 years. Not important for today. We're going to look at the ways in which mystical thought has made its way into the Jewish tradition, just so we can get a handle on what this is. And why am I spending all this time using the word mysticism when I haven't once talked about death or dying? The answer is as follows. Jewish mysticism presents us with a comprehensive new series of metaphors, vocabularies, and literatures to understand everything about life, death, the universe, and the place of the Jew within the cosmic framework. In other words, mysticism is, in its totality, a complete system of thought and belief vis-a-vis the larger Jewish tradition. Mysticism is like a religion within a religion. It's a comprehensive reimagination of Judaism. And therefore, it has much to say about the nature of human life and death and what happens after we die. And we're going to see how that emerges. But you can't really just take this one little piece out and say, well, what do the mystics say about what happens after we die? It doesn't work that way. You have to understand, what do Jewish mystics think and believe? And then you will get a handle on how Jewish mystical or Kabbalistic thought has deeply influenced the age-old conversation on what happens after we die. Now, when I first taught this curriculum over 10 years ago, I have to admit that I think I even admitted to the class how exasperated I was every time I tried studying Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah. I found it completely bewildering. And perhaps you will leave this class feeling the way I did. There's Jewish tradition that says a person should not even study Kabbalah until reaching the age of 40. And at the time, 10 years ago, I think when I first taught this class, or 9 years ago, I had not yet reached the age of 40. Now I'm 46. And not only because of age and experience, but also especially because over these last 10 years, I have dedicated a lot of my study to reading and trying to understand Kabbalistic literature, and especially the literature of the early Hasidic teachers and their disciples, and neo-Hasidic literature, all of which is basically part of the same DNA strand that begins with the Zohar, the chief work of Jewish mysticism in the 13th century, all the way through the followers of the Kabbalah as expressed by Isaac Luria, sometimes called Lurianic Kabbalah. We'll talk about that today. All the way down to the Hasidic era, starting in the early 18th century, up through the 20th century, into what is popularly referred to as Neo-Hasidism. It's all of a type. You cannot understand Hasidic writing, either 18th century Hasidic writing or the writing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zichrono Livracha, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, without understanding how Kabbalah functions and the chief metaphors and the architecture of Kabbalah. So what we're going to look at today is a fairly recent author. Now, he died in 1935, so not that recent, Harav Avraham Kook, who was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of the pre-statehood Israel settlement, or the Yishuv. Kook is a religious Zionist. Basically, Kook's brand of Zionism, very influential Zionist writer and thinker, Kook's brand of Zionism is that the political aspirations of the early Zionists for statehood, and this feels like an especially relevant conversation for this morning when yesterday was Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's 72nd anniversary of Israel's statehood. And Friday night, tomorrow evening at 6:15, we will be, everybody please mute yourself. I'll do it for you. WRT will celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut tomorrow at services. I'll say more about that before we conclude today. So Kook declared that political Zionism was an insufficient expression of the Zionist dream. Yes, it is important that Jews who do not have bright prospects in Europe at the time, late 19th century, early 20th century, first few decades of the 20th century when Kook is writing, prolifically, by the way. He basically believed that the return of the Jewish people to Israel was a fulfillment of the divine will, and that it was a grand and grandiose expression of the way in which Jewish people were partnering with God to enact God's will on earth. In other words, he's fundamentally mystical in his orientation. To quote again before from Dr. Rufus Jones, mysticism is that religious expression which puts the emphasis on the immediate awareness of the relation between the person and God. Okay, so a little bit of Harav Kook. This will require that I share my screen. Thank you. We have a nice comment just to me that panim means a face, yes, or can mean interior, or can mean intrinsic. So yeah, Panei Shabbat is a great expression. In the Lechadodi, it could mean the innermost expression of the Sabbath. Beautiful. I have another question privately from a member of the class. Does this tie into the doing of mitzvot on behalf of a deceased person in order to elevate that person's neshama or soul? Because this has led to the tradition of making donations on Yontif, leading to the printed book of memory, which is even done at WRT. The answer is maybe. We know that people were paying money to memorialize their dead long before the Zohar was ever written, so long before there was a kind of organized expression of Jewish mysticism, and in fact caused quite some controversy in the 11th or the late 10th, early 11th centuries when Jews wanted to pay money to have a book printed with the names of their deceased loved ones, a book of the dead, and would start reading, for instance, the names of dead people before saying Kaddish. That is not a biblical custom. Of course, it's probably the only way you've ever experienced a mourner's Kaddish is to hear names recited beforehand. That custom, which certainly adheres in almost every Reform congregation that I am aware of, is not a mystical thing so much. However, the idea of doing a mitzvah or making a donation, quote unquote, to elevate a person's soul after he died, yeah, that's definitely an idea that is at least consonant with Jewish mystical thought about what happens after we die. The mystics take this idea of the soul being immortal and the body being just, raw material meat that disintegrates, but there's something in us which is immortal and that has maybe not only its own agency, but is tied up with what we here, the living now, are doing. Yeah, that's definitely embedded within Kabbalistic thought. And we'll look at some of that. Okay, I'd like to look at some Rav Kook. So I'm going to just share a little bit from a handout. Forgive the quality of the print. I had to go to the office and find my printed files and take some photographs so you can see this is like pretty old school here. But we're looking at an excerpt from Orot HaKodesh, which is Harav Kook's compilation of writing, literally the Lights of Holiness. And this is from a book called The Way into Jewish Mystical Tradition, edited and compiled by our colleague, our Reform rabbi colleague, Rabbi Larry Kushner, who wrote many important works like Honey from the Rock. And you've probably in one way or another encountered Larry Kushner, not Harold Kushner. These are two rabbis named Kushner. Harold Kushner wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Larry Kushner did not. Okay. Poor Charlotte Bernardo, still trying to join the Zoom. Okay. All right, this is what Kook has written. If you want, O creature of flesh and blood, contemplate the light of God's presence throughout all creation. Contemplate the ecstasy of spiritual existence and how it suffuses every dimension of life, spiritual and material, right there before the vision of your body and the vision of your soul. Meditate on the wonders of creation and the divine life within them, not in some diluted form as a mere performance distant from your vision, but instead know it as the reality within which you live. Know yourself and know your world. Know the meditations of your own heart and of every sentient being. Locate the source of life deep within you, high above you, and all around you, the wondrous splendor of life within which you dwell. Now raise the love you feel within you to the source of her strength and the ecstasy of her glory. Let her blossom within every meditation. For the cascade of the soul of the life of the worlds is a splendor only diminished by the vantage point of the one who seeks to understand. See the lights and see what is within them. Don't let the holy names and phrases and letters overwhelm your soul, for they have been given over into your hand and not you into theirs. In other words, don't get caught up in the specific language of the liturgy. The goal of encountering Jewish text, whether that is prayer or study, or even the performance of familiar Jewish rituals, it's not about the actual letter of the text or the writing or the performance of those rituals. It's about the much deeper experience that is open to you, that all of these familiar Jewish traditions, whether it is prayer or study or performance of ritual or fulfillment of mitzvot, all of these are actually just invitations to a much deeper experience of the encompassing reality of God, or the source of life, in everything you do. And then he goes on from there. But I think that the first couple of paragraphs give you a taste for his perspective on what a Jewish life is actually all about. This is perhaps one of the most pure and I think simple distillations of what Kabbalah is supposed to be about. This is sort of at the biggest level. Cook is talking about the mystical experience as all that which allows a person to have a direct, intimate experience of God. And this is a good place, now that you've seen that, for me to allow anyone to raise a hand who wants to ask a question or make a comment. By the way, again, this is really, really difficult literature to quote unquote get, so I'll do my best to answer your questions, if you have any. And again, you have to use the digital raise hand function because I can't see your actual hands. Okay, Steve Maskett, you are now unmuted. Or maybe you're not. Let me try again. Steve, why don't you unmute yourself, please?
Sure. I find the most interesting thing about that passage is this quote, only diminished by the vantage point of the one who seeks to understand. That in essence, the direct experience of God, of this mystical, I'll call it the I-thou relationship, but is available to anyone. And if you're not experiencing it, change something.
Yes. Thank you. By the way, I have a chat going on, a private question or comment that asks, how does Rav Kook's mystical Zionism, or his expression of Hasidism, therefore also mystical, and that's a very important comment, fit in with the Satmar group's views of messianic thought? Let me just underscore the important point. All Hasidism is mystical in orientation. Every strand of Hasidism, at the trunk, or I should say the root of Hasidism, is the writing of the Baal Shem Tov, who lived in the early part of the 18th century. The Baal Shem Tov raised up a number of disciples, including his own children and grandchildren, and many of his followers. And the chief insight of the Baal Shem Tov, the father of Hasidism, is a way of understanding that phrase that I said we would come back to earlier, that radically altered the way in which it is conventionally used. That phrase is Melo Chol Haaretz Kivodo, from the Isaiah's vision of God on the throne, and the vision that prompts the prophet to exclaim, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Melo Chol Haaretz Kivodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. Normally we would say the whole earth is filled with God's glory. The Baal Shem Tov has a fascinating new way of understanding Melo Chol Haaretz Kivodo. Instead of saying the whole earth is filled with God's glory, he says that this text really comes to say that the earth in all its fullness is an expression of the divine. In other words, everything that we see, touch, feel, experience, know, taste, smell, hear, every experience, whether dwelling in the realm of just consciousness, thought, or feeling, or perceived through the senses, everything is God. So the Baal Shem Tov went on to say the following, which becomes the kind of Magna Carta of Jewish mysticism. In Aramaic, the word is leit atar panui mine, which literally means there is nothing devoid of God. Or, even more compactly put, everything is God. In Yiddish, alles ist Gott. Everything is God. There is nothing that is not God. Whether you are having a prayer experience in shul, or singing a nigun, or eating a hot dog, it's all God. Speaking of hot dogs, there's a joke about this which resonates with Kabbalists. So normally the joke is, what did the Zen Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? But I'll just change it. What did the Kabbalist say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. So that's mysticism right there, and including Satmar Hasidism. Now, I know very little about the Satmarim. I've never studied their community or their beliefs. I know a little bit about them, and if you watch the really compelling Netflix mini series, it's just 4 episodes of about 45 minutes each. Kelly and I just finished watching it last night. It's called Unorthodox. I highly recommend it. And it's based on a true story, though it takes real licenses with that story. But it's a watch the making of little 20-minute thing when you're done with it. But it focuses on a young woman who basically frees herself, escapes at great risk from her Satmar Hasidic community in Williamsburg, and flees to Berlin to start a new life away from the clutches of that very, very, very restrictive community. But interesting, the Satmars are Chassid. So yes, the short answer to the question I got is Satmar Hasidim and their views about the bringing about a Messiah are fundamentally mystical in origin. Whether or not, though, I don't think that they would in any way have much respect for Rav Kook, because the Satmars are anti-Zionist. Even the Satmars who live in Israel are anti-Zionist. They believe that the Israeli government, the regime currently sovereign in Israel, is illegitimate. And we talked about that a little bit. When did we talk about that? No, sorry, that was in a melting class that I taught 2 weeks ago. They believe that Zionism is an illegitimate expression of political will against the will of the divine. However, the bigger threads on mystical experience, the way Cook rhapsodically writes about the mystical experience, the Satmarim would say the same thing. And that's why they, like all Hasidic communities, are intensely focused on the experience of lived Judaism. And they believe that every mitzvah a Jew does is a way of coming closer to the divine and bringing about the redemption at the hands of Mashiach ben David. I have a question from Fran or Steve Siegel. It sounds to me that one must have empathy as a foundation in order to study and appreciate mysticism. Well, I don't know. Let me, why don't you unmute yourself and say why you asked that? I'm not sure that it has anything to do with empathy, but I'd be curious to see where you got that from.
Hi. So I'm always interested in how you affect change in yourself and have fundamental behaviors that you build on in order to become a better person. And one of the fundamental ones of early childhood is the development of empathy, the ability to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. And as you that, what Rav Kook says, it occurred to me that it's not just putting yourself, that's step one, putting yourself in the shoes of someone else, which is very almost simplistic, but putting yourself in the position of what God has put on the earth for us to appreciate. put yourself in the place of God, to put yourself in the place of group, not just one-on-one, but understanding that if you can understand that God is one and you are one with God, you've got to have that ability to move outside of your own needs and see it from another perspective. And it starts with the development of empathy in childhood.
Beautiful, beautiful, friend. Thank you for elaborating on your comment there. I think that's really important to realize that there are ethical dimensions of mystical thought that are well attested in the Jewish tradition, both in the written tradition and that are very consonant with my own understanding. That if indeed we accept the mystic's conclusion that what we experience, for instance, as the self, is not really a self. And we'll look at a text that actually says that. You know, we human beings, I think, are by nature kind of governed by our brains, which perceive beings as individualized, right? So, and we have a kind of like a human tendency, it's in our nature to categorize things. So we look at a tree and we say, okay, this part's the trunk, here are the roots, these are branches, these things over here are leaves, that's a flower, and this is fruit. But the fact of the matter is, at some very real level, and this is where mysticism and science actually converge very harmoniously, I believe, it's all just one thing, right? I mean, who's to say where the trunk stops and a branch begins? Or where a branch stops and a leaf begins. At some very deep level, it's all connected. And even more, how can we speak of a tree as an entity separate from the soil that nourishes it and from the water that it is breathing in through its leaves and through its xylem and phloem in its wood? I'm reading The Overstory now by Richard Powers. I recommend at least the first 150 pages. After that, I have some real problems with the book. But the first 150 pages are as good as any work of literature I've ever read. Richard Powers' The Overstory. I can't say enough about the first 150 pages of the book. And again, after that, I've got a lot to say, but I won't here. But basically, you know, is a tree a separate entity from the forest in which it lives? Powers makes a compelling case that the answer to that question is no. And similarly, you know, I like to think that I'm a being distinct from my surroundings, but if I were to hold my breath for 3.5 minutes, I would be heartily disproved. In other words, I am dependent on, and you think about what does that mean about the self's relationship with the other? Yes, there is a mystical orientation toward ethical obligation, if that makes sense, or the root of which is empathy. So thank you. I think that's really nice. I'm gonna unraise my dad's hand and unmute him so he can comment.
Just wanted to point out, can you hear?
Yep.
Wanted to point out you don't have to go to Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh for this thought, but it's part of the Shakrit service, Ma Rabu Ma'asecha Adonai. You know, how magnificent are the works of your hand. The whole earth is filled with your glory. Yep. I think that's another expression of that kind of Kabbalistic.
Right. For the mystic, an encounter with nature is not just about observing that which is other from you. Oh, look at that Grand Canyon. Look at that river. Like, look at what God made. The difference between Ma Rabu Ma'asecha Adonai and conventional a mystical way of understanding creation is Ma Rabu. The psalmist says, how great are the works that God has created. The mystic says, that river is as much God as I am God. Okay. And that's a little bit different. The God of the mystics is both transcendent and immanent. IMMANENT, meaning very near. Not immanent with an I, which means close by in time, but immanent meaning near in space. And we're going to look at that in a minute. But yes, I mean, the result is the same, which is an orientation of awe, wonder, sublimity. But I think that the conventional Judaism externalizes the deity as the creator. Mystical Judaism internalizes God as the ever-present flow in and of the cosmos.
So are we trying to get back to our pre-conscious right brain, where we experience God, the way Moses and Abraham did?
There's no getting back to for the mystic. It's much more that if you are able, if you make yourself able, all of the things that divide us from that consciousness which is there already will disappear. So the metaphor that's given to us by the same Larry Kushner goes like this. He tells this wonderful story of learning to play the clarinet in a collection of essays called I'm God, You Are Not. And he says when he turned 60 years old, he decided to take up the clarinet, and he started meeting privately with a music teacher. And he had to learn from the ground up not just how to play the instrument, but how to read music. And so he would follow a staff line of music in which there are 4 beats to every bar. And at the end of every bar, there's like just a little straight line. Anyone who reads music knows that those are called bar lines. And what he would do is he would play the notes and observe the rests in every bar. And then when he got to a bar line, he would stop momentarily, and then he would play the next bar. And the teacher, exasperated, said, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "Why are you stopping?" He says, "Well, there's a line there." And he says, he says, "The line's not there. The line is there only so that you can read the music, so that you can play the melody. The line doesn't actually exist." And Kushner, in his brilliant way, very compactly, elaborates outward from that image to a grand metaphor about the way the mystic understands the cosmos. That mountain that you see over there that you're so impressed with, that's not actually what's there. What's there is God. So the idea of separateness, we'll come back to this, is, I think, that erasing the notion that you are a being separate from the rest of the created world is the chief fallacy that Kabbalah wishes to expose and remove. Okay, let's look at another text here because this is fun. So I'm going to just go to the next one. So this is from Yechiel Michal of Zlochov, or known as the Zlochover Rebbe, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, also 18th century. And I think that this will help us further understand how mystics orient themselves to the religious project. And now the they of this is, so Reb Yechiel is talking about those who seek devekut with God. Devekut is a word that comes from the Hebrew root dalet bet kuf, or devek, which is also, by the way, the modern Hebrew word for glue or tape, like sticky. Okay, so devek literally means sticky or stickiness, and devekut means the quality of sticking or binding. And so he's talking about anyone who wishes to have a kind of sticky relationship with God, or who wishes to cling to God, yearns to make themselves one with the Holy One, likening themselves to nothingness. So the one of the chief images in the Zohar is that the ultimate expression of God is Iying, which means nothing. In other words, God is so far beyond the ability of the human being to understand or experience that we can only best describe God as the great beyond, or the great nothingness. And ultimately, the goal of the mystical approach to religion is to commune with that, to become one with the Iying that is God. They understand that were it not for the power of the Creator who continuously creates and sustains them at each moment. So this is, again, a little bit different from Ma Rabu Ma'asecha Adonai, which means how great are your works, Adonai. That's more conventionally take on the Torah saying, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The mystic says, no, creation is happening at every second of every moment of every hour of every day. Creation is, God is creating right now, right? The way in which your cells in your body are right now dying and regenerating, that's God. That's God creating. Not so much God made the sun and the moon and the stars however many years ago, whether thousands if you're traditional or billions if you understand science, but rather that the energy that is powering the sun, the moon, and the stars, the light, the nuclear furnaces of all of the stars, that is a regenerative power of each and every moment. That's where you find God, not at some starting point in the distant past. So they understand, the true mystics understand that were it not for the power of the Creator who continuously creates and sustains them each moment, they would be nothing, just as they were before the creation. For indeed, there is nothing in the world except for God. There it is. There's the Magna Carta of mysticism. Leta tar panui mine. Nothing exists except for God. It is just the opposite of what everyone else in the world thinks. So again, the mystic is, or mystical writing is esoteric. It's only for the people who really get it. They assume that when they do not merge with their Creator, but cleave instead to the things and matters of this world, that they amount to something, right? Most of us are very much occupied in the pursuit of putting food on the table and caring for ourselves and our loved ones and making sure that our material needs and desires and aspirations are met. He's basically saying, if you think that's what it takes to amount to something, and his word for something is yesh, it's the quality of itness in Hebrew. Yesh is also a word that means there is. Like if I want to say, there is a glass of water in front of me, I would say, yesh kos mayim lefanai. There is a glass of water. Or I could just say, yesh li kos mayim, which means I have a glass of water. But literally, there is unto me a glass of water. So yesh, though, in the mystical understanding, is something, or itness. They imagine that they are important. In other words, the standard measures of achievement, attainment, material success, that people think is what makes them important, he's going to tear down that thought. But how could anyone that might not wake up the next morning be important? In other words, if all you understand is that which is fleeting and transient, then you have no importance at all. One night it's here, the next it's gone. Quoting Jonah 4:10, that's Jonah's lament about the plant that God puts over Jonah's head to provide him shade from the heat in the very last chapter of Jonah that we hear on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. And then this plant, which had provided some relief from the heat, withers up and dies at God's command. And Jonah's like, what the hell? Why did you make that go away? Well, that's what the nature of life is. As we read in Psalms, their days pass away like a shadow. Even while they're alive, it's all a show of vanity. So most people are spending their days pursuing what they think is something, but actually amounts to nothing. As opposed to the mystics, the good, the people he's valorizing here, who are in pursuit of nothingness. They're in pursuit of total communion with something that is so far beyond conventional human experience. That's what amounts to something in life. So he'll go on to say, in this way, if they think they are something, then alas, they are nothing. On the other hand, if because of their fusion with the Creator, cleaving with all their physical and mental powers, they think of themselves as nothing, then they are very great indeed. So the idea of the mystic, or the goal of the mystic, is to have an absolute communion with the source of all, recognizing that the self is just an illusion. That little, like the self is just as much an illusion as that measure bar in Larry Kushner's musical, in Larry Kushner's written sheet music is an illusion. It's not really there. It's just there to help you make sense of the melody, the underlying melody, which could be understood as the flow of divinity throughout that which we perceive as the created universe. The last paragraph gets at the heart of it. It's like a single drop of water fallen into the sea. It has returned to its source. It is one with the ocean. Now it's no longer possible to identify it as an independent thing in any way whatsoever. Right? So Do you see yourself as an independent entity, or are you more like the mystic, the Kabbalist who orders a hot dog and all the mystic wants is make me one with everything? Okay. Notice we've gotten almost all the way through our class today and we haven't even really talked about what happens after we die. So I think we should do that because, again, mysticism isn't contained in a single book. So mysticism upholds the idea that soul and body can be understood as differentiated from one another. I think if you take to heart the passage we just read from this early Hasidic rabbi, you can see that, right? He's basically saying that the pursuit of the material is nothing, is vanity, even though we think that's what makes us something. There's something greater about the universe, and that is God. Similarly, mystics tend to believe that we have that element of humanity, which is material and therefore illusory. The mystic would say, well, this body of mine, this stuff that's just, meat or matter, that's not really who I am. But there is an immortality to the soul. So in other words, this idea of the body and soul being distinct from one another does inform mysticism. It may not be phrased the way Aristotelian or Platonic philosophy puts it, but it is very, very much at the heart of the mystical understanding of the human condition. And so the unique additional contribution that Kabbalah makes to this part of the conversation is an idea that Dr. Rose raised for us, Elliot raised last week, when he said, well, what about the idea of reincarnation? So as opposed to Maimonides, the chief concern about what happens when we die for the Kabbalists is not what will happen in a grand resurrection to come. Kabbalists are more interested in what is the fate of my soul or my self, which, remember, for the mystic, the self is an illusion. You're not really a self. You are one with God, and you just think that you're a self. So slightly different metaphorical language for describing similar ideas, that there's a soul or that which is immortal, which is the real you. Mystical literature seems to have picked up along the way a number of ideas that Neil Gaiman, in his book, The Death of Death, believes are not indigenous, but rather he calls them part of Oriental tradition. We would say today Eastern thought. And this is consistent with what we know about, for instance, Buddhism and its own and the Vedic traditions, Hinduism. There's a lot in those Eastern spiritual traditions about the idea that a soul is immortal but continues to get incarnated in different bodies across the eternity of time. So, again, taking this baseline assumption that soul and body are separate and then mapping onto that a possibly foreign, originally Eastern idea that the soul, being immortal, takes up residency in different bodies over time, leads to an idea that in Kabbalistic writing is called Gilgul HaNefashot, literally the rolling over of souls. We idiomatically translate Gilgul HaNefashot as reincarnation. The idea here is that a person is actually a living incarnation of a pre-existing soul that may have belonged to another person beforehand. So if this idea strikes you as very much Hindu, you may be surprised to hear that it is part of the Jewish tradition. Let me show you a text from this page here. Nope. Is that the one I want? Oh, shoot. Did I not copy it? I think that I forgot to copy. But fortunately, I have a hard copy here, and I can share it with you. So give me a second. Yeah, I forgot to photograph this page. So hang on for a second. I'll just stop the screen share for a moment so you can see me again. I feel so bad. We have people who keep knocking on the waiting room door. I don't know why they're having so much trouble joining the Zoom this morning. And then I'll get a couple more hands. So
You let me in.
you are in.
No, on my phone. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I don't see it in the waiting room, Anne. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I can only let in people who are in the waiting room. Okay. So this text is from a book called Sefer HaBahir, which is a 12th century pre-Zohar French text that is one of the seminal early works of Jewish mysticism. And it is written there. Why is there a righteous person who experiences good, but another righteous person who may experience evil? This is because the second righteous person was wicked previously and is now being punished. I am not speaking of his present lifetime or his childhood deeds. I am speaking about what he has already been previously. Go out and see. And here's the metaphor. What is this life? A person planted a vineyard and hoped to grow some grapes, but instead, sour grapes grew for him. He saw that his planting and his harvest were not successful, so he tore it out. He cleaned out the sour grapevines and planted it again. When he saw that his planting was not successful again, he tore it up and planted it again. So that's the metaphor that Sefer HaBahir, this early work of French mysticism from the 12th century, provides for understanding Gilgul HaNefashot, the rolling over of the souls, or reincarnation. Basically, the grand scheme of God's plan for humanity is that there's this eternal soul. It is embodied in a person. That person still has free will. If that person sins, the soul may be punished in the next incarnation. So these texts, by the way, take us all the way back to Daniel because they explain the theodicy problem. Theodicy, again, meaning the challenge of God's justice. In other words, this is really more about why do bad things happen to good people. If you cannot reconcile the fact that a good person, a righteous person, suffers misfortune with a good and powerful God, this provides one way around that. The answer it provides is, well, that person may be good, but he's experiencing misfortune because his soul was embodied in a bad guy in a previous life, and that bad guy sinned but wasn't punished during his lifetime. So unfortunately, the new guy, the new host for the soul, is the one to suffer. I do not find this particularly theologically satisfying, but that wasn't my goal. My goal isn't to make you happy. My goal is to educate you. Right, somebody wrote Groundhog Day. Exactly right. Except in Groundhog Day, Bill Murray is an ass, and he has to. Groundhog Day is much more about teshuva, right? There's no idea that that the character that Bill Murray plays is being punished because he was a jerk in a previous life. He's just a jerk in this life, and but he gets this wonderful chance to do it over and over and over and over again till he gets it right. That does resonate, though, with the idea of the sour grapes. So in other words, the soul is like those grape plantings, and the planter, that is to say, God, will keep planting the grapes until they grow sweet. Okay, so that's an early idea, though, that maps the idea of an eternal soul onto this idea of Gilgul HaNefashot, or reincarnation. Judy, you've been waiting a long time to ask a question. Judy Gross. So would you like to chime in? No. Okay, you have to unmute yourself if you want to. I'm going to give you one more moment to do that. Hang on.
Okay.
Okay. Hi.
My question was from an earlier moment in your lecture, but most recently, it seems as though the reincarnation could be the answer to why poor Job has such a a tough
Yes.
time.
That's right.
He's answering for someone else's sins. But
Yeah, if only we didn't have the part of the book of Job that makes it very clear that that's not the case, and that Job is totally innocent, and that God accepted literally a devil's bargain.
the first question, however, was relating to the oneness of all and the Shema. Is that
Beautiful.
Is that
Beautiful.
a mystical connection?
Beautiful. So yes, thank you. So glad you asked the question. Of course, the Shema is another example of a text like Melochol Haaretz Kivodo that the Kabbalists have a field day with. Because the plain sense of Shema, first of all, did you know that Shema is a perfect haiku? If you think that a haiku, you were taught, is a Japanese-style poem of 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, or something very close to it, that makes a kind of observation about the universe and one's place within the universe. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, is a perfect haiku in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, the eternal is our God, the eternal Echad is one. Now, conventional Jewish theology presents the Shema as the ultimate declaration of monotheism. Listen up, Jewish people, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai is our God. In other words, Yahweh, this God is our God. Adonai Echad. Now that could mean only Adonai. In other words, not all those other gods that are presented as gods. You know, having just been in Egypt a couple months ago, the Pharaoh presenting as the living God and often taking on the dress and the iconography of the patron god for the Pharaoh and his regime. No, only God is God. Maybe that's what the Shema is saying. But for the Kabbalist, the Shema says something much different and much bolder. The Kabbalist reads the phrase this way: Shema Yisrael, okay, that part we get. Attention, Jewish people. Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Yahweh, our God, Yahweh is the unity. In other words, and Yahweh is also a word that is inverted to spell Havaya, which means existence. So Yahweh is made up of 4 letters, Yud, He, Vav, He, none of which has a clear vocalization on its own, but rather is part of breath. So many people believe that the phrase or the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, Yud, He, Vav, He, was actually just the sound of breathing. So this flow of breath and soul experience, Yud, He, Vav, He, that we think of as our God, Yud, He, Vav, He, Echad. In other words, the only thing that exists is Yud, He, Vav, He. God is the oneness of everything. When Einstein and other physicists speak of a grand unified theory of everything, a way of reconciling the findings of traditional Newtonian mechanics, for instance, which for 3 and more centuries governed the way scientists and astronomers understood the universe. How that reconciles against quantum mechanics, the answer is we don't know. Quantum mechanics has a very different understanding of how the universe came into being and what happened at the time of or even before the Big Bang. And Einstein went to his grave not having found what he most desperately sought for the latter part of his career, which was a scientific theory that could be mathematically demonstrated that would reconcile the findings of quantum theory against or with traditional Newtonian mechanics and relativity. So in any case, that idea of echad, meaning not that there's only one God, but that God is the way we understand that everything is one. Ancient philosophers are sometimes identified as promoting this theory, which is known as monism, M-O-N-I-S-M. It's the same thing that basically says that, look, the coffee in my cup are 2 distinct things, right? The monist would say, no, they're not. It's all the same stuff. It's all one. And by the way, I'm one with my coffee. And in a scientifically demonstrable way, I actually am right now. By the way, I'm one with the air I'm breathing. I'm one with every one of us who's participating in this dialogue, because conversation is itself, by definition, an experience of erasing the boundary, the artificial boundary imposed by the conventional understanding that I am a self distinct from you and your self. It's one reason I like Talmud study or Jewish study so much, is that it actually puts us into conversation with people that we think of as dead. But you tell me, after last week, is Maimonides dead for you? Or is Maimonides very much alive in a very real way? In other words, if you are a different person this week, or if your intellect has grown because of something Maimonides wrote 800 years ago, can it really be said that you and Maimonides are not in some way united? So the mystic seeks ways of understanding radical connectedness in a world, and against, I think, conventional human nature, that for reasons that are probably evolutionarily advantageous, necessitates that most of the time we have to think of ourselves as selves. But the mystic wants to spend as much time as possible swimming in the sea of radical connection, of radical being sublimated into the oneness of all existence. Okay, that's some pretty heavy stuff. I warned you, right? And by the way, the key point I want to raise here is that if you get that about the projects or the project of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, then it forces you to reconsider what death means. In effect, death is part of the illusion, right? The truth is that you weren't really you the way you thought of you before you were born, and nor after you die. That we put a lot of investment in this, right? My appearance, my clothes, my selfness, and yet the mystic wants to open us up to the much, much greater pervasive truth that you were never really you as a distinct entity at any point in your existence, not for the millennia or eons before you were embodied in your current incarnation, and neither again once you are what we think of as dead. That's the bigger mystical insight into the meaning of life and death. And that's why I had to give you kind of a big overview of Kabbalah before we could talk about afterlife, because afterlife is just a small expression of the much bigger way that mystics understand our place in the universe. And this is what I didn't get 10 years ago when I taught this material. Like, I could teach you about transmigration of souls and all of the concepts that are within mysticism, but I wasn't seeing the big picture. Cantor Kleiman and I have had the great privilege of having been accepted into a 42-person cohort, all rabbis and cantors from all different denominations, all across America, Canada, and Israel. The clergy leadership program of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. In fact, later this afternoon, I have a study session with my Chavruta partner, Rabbi Jenny Rosen, who runs a new organization called Dayenu, a Jewish call for climate change, a Jewish response to climate change. We're, of course, on Zoom. She lives in Manhattan. We study every week mystical and neo-Hasidic texts. That's our curriculum. So starting this past January, Cantor Kleiman and I had the opportunity to travel for our first of 4 scheduled retreats with the 40 or so other rabbis and cantors in our cohort, who include some people you may know, like Rabbi Ken Chasen, my predecessor as the associate rabbi of Westchester Reformed Temple from 1998 to 2003. So Kenny's in our cohort, and it's a wonderful group, really, really interesting, smart, thoughtful people. But we are being trained comprehensively in Jewish mystical traditions, and that includes not only sacred study, but it includes silent meditation and contemplation, prayer, yoga, group work. It's very intense. Unfortunately, our July retreat has been canceled on account of the pandemic. We're probably going to have to hold it by Zoom. I don't know what that's going to look like. So anyway, that's where I've really gotten to develop a little bit more, not just familiarity with Jewish mysticism, but a kind of a deeper comfort level and understanding with the way in which the Kabbalist thoroughly reimagines the Jewish project. Harriet, you have a hand up. I unmuted you.
Oh, unmute.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. I remember once asking you about the soul, and you don't find the soul in so much in the Jewish literature. At least I haven't seen it. Is that because it can't be split up? It's all one, and the soul and the body and everything belongs to God, is God.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, I think that it is consonant with Jewish mysticism to declare that that soul and body alike are all just part of the Echad, or the Great One, that we can call God, if you want to call it God. However, early mystical literature still clings to, and not even early, much mystical literature through the Hasidim still clings to the, now I would call conventional, the idea that we first read about in Plato, idea that matter and soul, or body and soul, are distinct one from the other. Ultimately, both body and this thing we call soul are part of the oneness of God. And so, yes, you're right. I think the distinction between the two is something that you could make too much of if you really understand that the mystical project isn't really about bodies or souls at all. It's about elevating one's consciousness to acknowledge that you are not distinct from God. Right? Again, if you can't remember what mysticism's about, I've given you one line. In Aramaic, letatar panu imine, there is nothing devoid of God. Nothing. No matter, no thought, no energy, no conversation, no object, no planet. It's all God, right? So thank you, Harriet. I got a private question about the doctrine in the Torah, and raised up by the prophet Ezekiel, by the way, that says the sins of the fathers will be brought upon, or the punishment for the sins of the fathers will be incurred by the third and even the fourth generations. I would say that is not indigenous to Jewish mystical thought, but a book like Sefer HaBahir, the one that gave us that idea of the grape plantings, the sour grapes, may resonate with that, right? I think the idea that a new body takes on the sins of the soul from a previous incarnation, you won't find that anywhere. That has no biblical analog whatsoever. There may be some ways of, using a fun text from the Torah to kind of underline that transmigration of souls idea, but it's certainly not biblically indigenous. Marcia Goldfinger, do you want to add a comment here? You're unmuted.
Okay. Well, I am very surprised at how much the idea of God being in everything and us being interconnected and not really separate resonates with me. They absolutely lose me with the idea of reincarnation and paying for the sins of previous generations. I mean, because that really eliminates the idea of a good and just and loving God, or intelligence of supreme being, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, for what little comfort it may...
The Kabbalistic idea of oneness and us really not being important in the scheme of the universe resonates a lot with me.
Thank you, Marcia. I don't know what comfort it will bring you to hear this, but I completely agree with you, both on what resonates for you, that also resonates for me, and what does not resonate for you also does not resonate for me. I find the whole idea of the transmigration of souls and incarnations in different bodies to be a distraction. But let's not forget, that is actually earlier in the ongoing development of Jewish mystical thought. And it really doesn't take center stage in, like, for instance, the writings of the early Hasidic rabbis and their disciples, so, which is mostly what I'm studying these days. I have to confess, I don't want to present myself as an expert in Kabbalah because the Zohar still presents itself as unapproachable to me, except for reading it with a good teacher and in excerpt only. So thank you for that. Sam Rothberg, let me unmute you for you.
Thanks. So when you're talking about monism and we're reading or learning about every soul or God is in everything, this reminds me a lot of Jainism.
Mm-hmm.
What do we say about animals and God's smallest creatures, and how does that fit in with this idea of God is in everything? I mean, are we sweeping the ground in front of us? Or we're wearing masks now, but are we wearing masks so we're not inhaling insects? How far do we go with this idea?
Yeah, I don't know enough about Jainism except that I can tell you that it's funny. Across world traditions, all of the mystical expressions of various world religions really start to resemble one another. They have so much in common because they all arrive at the same basic conclusion, that letatar panui mine, nothing is devoid of God. Nothing is not God. As for the place of little animals and creatures, it's so funny. In my experience of Kabbalistic writing and Hasidic and Neo-Hasidic writing, I have yet to encounter any significant reference that sticks in my mind of what all of this means for so-called lower beings. And there's a lot that suggests that human beings are unique, and this is, of course, recorded in the Bible, in the Torah, in Psalms, that human beings are unique because only we are conscious of our own mortality, only we have attributes both of all other flesh and blood expressions of the divine, meaning creatures, and the angels who are not flesh and blood, the angels who are purely divine. And ultimately, the mystical literature often appeals to that within the human being and the human experience, which is more like the angels, not the part that pursues food and sex and pleasure and material attainment, but that which can commune through thought and feeling and meditation and deepening consciousness and awareness alone on one's unity with God. That doesn't directly answer your question. It's merely my way of saying in all of the literature, I have not yet encountered a direct response to the question. Okay, so what I'm going to do is beg your forbearance as we extend past 11:45. And the nice thing about Zoom is if you feel you need to leave, it's no insult. You can quietly leave and the rest of the class will be recorded. But I want to spend 10 more minutes with you if you'll indulge me. And more to the point, those of you who want to, just stay on. So again, mysticism goes through a lot of incarnations of its own. Mysticism is itself kind of like a soul floating through different bodies. And one of the most prominent and most explored of those bodies is the expression of Kabbalah devised by, written about by the great 16th century sage who basically took his disciples to a remote mountaintop in the city of Tzfat in the northern part of Israel. His name was Isaac Luria. And his followers and he developed a way of understanding the Zohar that is called Lurianic Kabbalah. And in Luria's understanding of the Kabbalistic tradition, the history of the Jewish people becomes just a metaphor for a much larger drama in which the Jews and indeed the entire world and even God are all in exile together. So you can't understand Kabbalah, or Luria's understanding of Kabbalah, without reflecting on where it arises in Jewish history. It is a product of the traumatic aftermath of the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish expulsion. Sometimes we say the Inquisition, but the Inquisition was just a tool of the Catholic Church that contributed to the monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand's decree that Jews would either convert to Catholicism or leave on penalty of death. This, since the destruction of the temple in the year 70 and the failed Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135, this was incontrovertibly the greatest calamity to befall the Jewish civilization. the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula, which of course distributed Jewish people, we call them Sephardic, all over the Mediterranean Rim, Northern Africa, Italy, as far as Holland, and of course began the Jewish settlement of the New World as well, starting in South America and the Caribbean, and eventually making their way up to starting in Rhode Island. The Toro Synagogue, the name itself indicates the Sephardic heritage of its founding family, was the first synagogue built in North America, though it is, or in the United States of what would become the United States of America, though there's some fascinating conjecture that the first Jews to settle in what is now the United States were actually crypto-Jews, hidden Jews who had generation before fled the expulsion from Spain, fled Spain, settled in Mexico and Central America, and then migrated to Santa Fe. And there's some fascinating evidence that the early Jews of Santa Fe, who may even not have fully understood that they were Jews, but were preserving some of their tradition in secret, may have arrived in the United States even a century before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. So Lurianic Kabbalah imagines that the Jewish people are in exile with God, and that the project of the Jew and the Jewish people, and indeed all of humanity, is to perform Tikkun Olam, to repair the brokenness that exiled God from the world and bring God back to the realm of human affairs through righteous action, through prayer, through study, through song, through ritual. All of these mitzvot, or all of the stuff of Jewish life, is more about reestablishing God's place in the world, which is the ultimate purpose and aim of Tikkun Olam. Luria uses a grand series of metaphors, some of which may be familiar. A lot of Lurianic Kabbalah begins with a reimagination of what happened at the beginning of time, that when God created the universe, not, by the way we think of like a tinkerer or an inventor creating something. God's creation, as it were, was more of an emanation. So Luria contributes two major ideas to Jewish thought. He says, first of all, in order to create that which we understand as the physical universe, God had to contract into God's self to make room for anything that was not God. In the beginning, Isaac Luria says, everything was God. But in order to make room for the physical experience of the world, God performed an act called tzimtzum, which means contraction or self-contraction, drawing into oneself, which, by the way, even to this day is used as a way of describing the human attribute of humility or required humility. For instance, there's a convention of 500 rabbis, and everybody wants to lead the Shabbat morning service, but only 2 rabbis can lead the service, so 498 rabbis have to perform an act of tzimtzum. They have to contract themselves so as not to take up all the space in the room, right? Rabbis have to just make themselves like all the other congregants. So we sometimes use tzimtzum to mean humility, where one deliberately and intentionally self-contracts in order to make room, in this case for others, but in the Lurianic sense, God performs tzimtzum in order to make room for creation. And then the second new idea that Luria presents is something called Yiridat HaShefa, which literally means the flowing down of emanation. Then God's method, the way in which God creates, is again not by taking stuff and building, but rather by flowing into the universe. God enters into the physical at all times and at every moment. That is creation, and therefore, consistent with all other mystical thought in Judaism, the creation is ongoing. It's not something relegated to a moment in the past. There is a verse that every single person who has ever been in the sanctuary of Westchester Reformed Temple knows, even if you don't know that you know it. It's Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, and it's inscribed on our holy ark where we keep our Torah scrolls in the sanctuary. It says, "A river flows from Eden to water the garden." That is a weird verse to put on an ark. You will never see another temple that I know of that has that particular verse on the ark. Usually you'll see "Da lifnei mi ata omed," know before whom you stand, or all the earth is God's glory and its fullness thereof. I mean, I've seen lots of different verses from lots of different places on lots of different arcs, but only WRT has "a river flows from Eden to water the garden." And that is because that line is the most referenced line from the Torah in the Zohar. The Zohar, and Luria in particular, takes that verse to mean a river flows from Eden. Eden means the source of divinity. Eden is another name for Iying, or the great nothingness, the great beyond that I referred to about 45 minutes ago. The river that flows from the great beyond is the way in which divine presence or energy manifests itself in the created world. There's a conduit of divinity from beyond into that which we experience as real, the hashkot et hagan, to water the garden. And the purpose of that is that divinity nourishes the material world that human beings tend. And by the way, by placing it on the ark, the message that WRT is trying to communicate is that the Torah itself represents that liminal point where the Jewish people encounters that divinity and forms a kind of portal between divinity and the created world, which is why the back wall in which our ark is suspended is made of glass, and from the sanctuary looking outward, past the ark, you can see a garden. So the whole thing is a metaphor. The whole architecture of WRT Sanctuary is a metaphor derived from Lurianic Kabbalah. I don't know if you knew that, but now you know it. This way of thinking, Isaac Luria's way of thinking, made it possible to reconcile the two dimensions of God that I mentioned much earlier today. The transcendent, meaning that God is beyond, unreachable, unattainable, beyond all consciousness, cannot be understood, does not interfere or manifest in the realm of humanity or the realm of what we understand as the created universe, and the immanent, which of course is the dimension of religious experience that the mystic is trying to highlight. The immanent meaning the near, the intimate, the real, the felt experience of God. So this is how Lurianic Kabbalah fuses these two ideas of the transcendent on the one hand and the immanent on the other. That's just sort of a walkthrough. Again, what does that have to do with afterlife? Well, it makes it clear that what we think of as life and death are actually illusory, that we are all contained within the divine flow that is animating creation, all things, even as we speak. So let's end by looking at just a little bit more text, which I think will say what I'm trying to say much better than I. And then we'll take final questions. So if we look at some of the handouts that I photocopied here. Okay, yeah, this is actually from the Melila Helner Eshed, who is a teacher of Zohar, a teacher of Jewish mysticism. And she talks about how, I'm going to just look at this part here, the second paragraph, the souls above. The souls above that have no body in this world imbibe from the light that flows from the pure balsam, and they delight in that supernal delight. Now, this is what happens after you die. You become a soul, and you are in constant communion with God. The souls that have a body in this world ascend and imbibe from the light of that palanquin, meaning a sedan chair or the throne, and then they descend, and they give and they take. In other words, you don't need to wait until you're dead to commune with the divine. They, meaning the living, give of the fragrance of the good deeds they perform in this world, and they take from the fragrance found in the garden, meaning the supernal world, or the world of the transcendent. And all are found in the same garden. These ones delight above, and these ones delight below. That is just the second chapter in Zohar. And this, if you are confused by it, then you understand why I find it impossible to study Zohar. So let's look at something else. Zohar is just really trippy stuff. I think that Zohar may be one of those books best experienced under the moderating influence of certain controlled substances. Okay, this passage here, by the way, is a bit on Tzimtzum. I'll just read the first paragraph. Indeed, the cause and the reason for this Tzimtzum, this is God's self-withdrawal, and concealment, remember the central metaphor of Lurianic Kabbalah is that God is in exile from the world, is that the Holy One of Being concealed and hid the life force of the world in order that the world would appear as a discrete entity with independent existence. Appear is the key word, right? So God's plan was, by self-contracting and allowing creation to flow from the divine, was to make creation an optical illusion of something separate from God. But we know, just like the measure bars in Larry Kushner's sheet music, it's not really there. Any of you guys fans of The Matrix, it's the same idea, that what you experience as the world all around you isn't actually ultimate reality. Everyone knows that the whole purpose of the creation of the world was for the revelation of God's kingdom. So if God is all about revealing God's self to the people, why contract away from and hide from the experience of humanity? There, after all, can be no king without a people, which is to say, it is our role as subject to make God's kingship real in the world. So Luria will go on from there to say, you can actually do mitzvot in this world of action, thought, study, prayer, song, etc., that make God visible, whereas the normal state of affairs for most people is that God remains hidden or invisible. Last text, and then we'll open up. This isn't what I wanted. Shoot. I think I copied some of the wrong. No, here it is. So this was written by Richard Rubinstein, and it's basically a modern scholar's understanding of how mysticism functions. And I think this tells us a lot about how Kabbalah influences the Jewish conversation on life and death, probably much, much more. Gilman makes this point over and over again, that mysticism has been much more broadly and deeply influential on Jewish thought than Maimonides, in terms of what people really believe. And the fact that Hasidism as a phenomenon, and there's so much interest right now in Jewish mysticism. Basically, I have people ask me all the time, will you teach a course in Kabbalah? And I think you get a sense of today why I've been reluctant to do so. But maybe I'm ready. Maybe when I'm 50. Okay. Perhaps the best available metaphor for the conception of God as the holy nothingness is that God is the ocean and we are the waves. In some sense, each wave has its moment in which it is distinguishable as a somewhat separate entity. Nevertheless, no wave is entirely distinct from the ocean, which is its substantial ground. The waves are surface manifestations of the ocean. Our knowledge of the ocean is largely dependent on the way it manifests itself in the waves. The waves are caught in contradictory tendencies. They are the resultants of forces which allow them their moment of somewhat discrete existence. At the same time, they are wholly within the grasp of greater tendencies which ultimately collapse them into the oceanic ground out of which they have come and from which they have never really separated themselves. Okay, now you want to know what this has to do with what happens after we die? Here we go. So it is with all life. All living organisms seek to maintain their individual existence, yet there is absolutely nothing in them which does not derive from their originating ground. This is especially evident in the most intimate of all human activities, I would say all activities of all living beings, sexual love. Nothing could be more private or personally involving. Nevertheless, at no time is the individual more in the grip of universal forces than in the act of love. Furthermore, only to the extent that the individual is capable of letting these overwhelming forces flow through him of their own accord, will the act of love be complete and without flaw. Only He who has the capacity totally to lose himself in love can thereby be fulfilled. And this is an essay by Richard L. Rubinstein called Morality and Eros, quoted in that same anthology by Larry Kushner. So that's where I want to stop, but I want to invite anyone who has a comment or a thought or a question to raise it. You can begin by you can unmute yourself at this point if you like. I just unmuted all of you, so if you want to say something or add in, you're welcome to. Judy, you have a question.
Yvonne has
The notion of the ocean.
Hang on, Judy. I'm going to mute other people and then unmute you again. Okay, Judy, go for it.
Yvonne.
Oh, okay. I once read a book that a client of mine gave me, and it was written by a rabbi called Rabbi Ramchal, or Rabbi Moshe Halevi Luzzatto. And it says essentially what I remember is that everything is predetermined by God. God knows everything from the beginning to the end, life, death, etc. And there's nothing you can do about it. Everything is predetermined, but it allows the action of the human being to change the direction or end of his life. But even that has been predetermined by God without you really knowing that that's something that you can do. I don't know whether that fits at all into what we have talked about.
I think that there's some, thank you for the question, Yvonne. Look, I think that there's definitely some shared DNA between the God that you're describing and the God of Kabbalah. The difference is that the God of the Kabbalistic literature on through Hasidism is not anthropomorphic or anthropopathic. And those are two separate things. Anthropomorphic is a word you probably know, means that which takes on human form. Literally, anthro meaning man, and morph meaning form. So anthropomorphic means of human form. Looks like a man. So when God is described as having limbs or lips or eyes or nose or a voice or what have you, all of that is anthropomorphic. But even more, the Bible speaks of a God who is anthropopathic. And so that means having human feelings or behaviors. An anthropopathic God is a God who speaks, a God who knows, you use the word God knows all, a God who thinks, a God who feels. That is actually foreign to the way most Kabbalistic literature and Hasidic and Neo-Hasidic and all that kind of stems from the same DNA understands God. Because God, remember, is not a being separate from the creation in Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, God is just a way of talking about the grand unity of all of the cosmos. I was going to say all things, but it's not just things. It's not about matter. God is a way of describing, God is synonymous with the word cosmos, everything. Leta tar panui mine, right? The Aramaic phrase meaning there is nothing that is not God. Yes, in a sense, the idea that a human being can exert free will and it still exists within a grand scheme of a God who knows all, which is a more conventional theological framework, is not, I would say, totally out of step with the mystical view. But the mystical view takes it, puts it on steroids and takes it to its absolute farthest conclusion, which is that what you think of as independent thought and action, you frail mortal human being, is really just yet one more infinitesimally small emanation of the divine that is keeping you alive right now and animating your thoughts. It's not that you have free will and God knows all. It's that you are actually a manifestation of the divine unity of all created things. And even all uncreated things, all possibility, everything that existed in the past. You know, the idea that God is everything erases the idea of what is past, what is present, and future, because it includes not just the dimension of matter and space, but also all time. Okay, I've learned well that my dad should get the last word. So here you go, Dad.
You're too sweet. I am really happy that some of the last words from your mouth included the phrase cosmos, having been seminally influenced by Carl Sagan, and then the latest series of Cosmos just finished on Nat Geo. But
yeah, with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Right, but I think I'm curious as to if it were possible for the Kabbalists and the Zoharists, if they knew some of cosmology currently, if they wouldn't actually use that as proof text of their point of view.
Right. So thank you. This is a great place for us to end because, you know, look, I believe that a healthy Jewish relationship with theology is one that evolves over time. And I would hold myself up as kind of a living example of one whose theology within a Jewish framework has evolved dramatically over time. And these days, I like to think of myself or identify myself as exactly what you have given me an invitation to say, which is that I am a scientific mystic. Like if somebody were to ask me, can you describe your theology on one foot? Like while standing on one foot. And I'll say, yeah, I can do that better. I'll give you 2 words. I'm a scientific mystic. In other words, the central metaphors that the central metaphors of Jewish thought that resonate most with me as a Jew, as a human being, as a teacher of the tradition, as one who is trying to become more and more conversant with the vast Jewish tradition, the central metaphors that appeal to me most right now are all Kabbalistic, or more to the point, Kabbalistic as reframed and made, I think, more accessible by the early Hasidic writers. But I am equally a product of a Western liberal education with a strong grounding in science, which has been a passionate interest of mine since earliest childhood, as you especially, Mom and Dad, know. And what is most striking for me, I think, in the last 10 years of my study has been how convergent these different disciplines in fact are. And even in the absence of a definitive grand unified theory of everything, I believe that the more I understand of the way the world works, both through science and through the Kabbalistic metaphorical understanding of the universe, the more I believe that they are ultimately arriving at the same truths with a capital T. And that's a wonderful place for us to conclude. So I hope that you continue to remain healthy and safe. And maybe the next time you're taking a walk outside when it's sunnier than it is today, or the next time you are joining us for prayer services, as I hope you will tomorrow. And by the way, if you've ever traveled to Israel and have met a wonderful educator guide named Uri Feinberg, he's our guest speaker tomorrow night. He'll be joining me via video link and Cantor Kleinman to celebrate a little bit of Yom Ha'atzmaut. So maybe the next time you're praying or the next time you're singing or listening to music, you all, for maybe even for only a fraction of a second, or meditating or doing exercise, maybe even for a fraction of a second, the measure bar will disappear and you will not think of yourself as a self distinct from whatever else you are experiencing in that moment. And then you've just grown as a Jewish mystic. So have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, and I hope to see you again really soon. Bye-bye.